The MX was designed to offset the vulnerability of the Minuteman II missile force to large Soviet ICBMs. The Carter administration failed to decide on a mobile basing mode for the MX, and the Reagan administration eventually put them in Minuteman II silos, but they never really solved the dilemma of how really to base these missiles. Now, as for the defense of Western Europe, Brown was instrumental in obtaining NATO members' agreements to station nuclear-armed Pershing II and ground-launched cruise missiles on their soil to counter the mobile Soviet SS-20. And in the realm of conventional warfare, with the help of longtime bureaucratic player Bob Blowtorch Comer, Brown and the Pentagon spearheaded an effort to upgrade NATO's conventional forces. At home, Brown faced an all-volunteer force that was by no means assured of success. And to overcome recruiting shortfalls, Brown supported General Maxwell Thurman, who is credited with revamping the Army's recruiting campaign. This is, next slide, this is the iconic All You Can Be, one of the All You Can Be posters, which really became the sort of symbol of the Army for many years. Now, to offset the fact that there were not that many qualified males at the Pentagon, not that many qualified male recruits, Brown's Pentagon encouraged the enlistment of women in the armed services and opened combat-related, not combat, but combat-related roles for them. And this is one of the famous posters about some of our best men or women. Now, finally, Brown, with the encouragement, and that can go down too, Brown, with the encouragement of Brzezinski, reoriented U.S. policy from Central Europe to the Persian Gulf and Southwest Asia. Brown and the Pentagon created a framework of security in the region based on pre-positioning and access agreements with friendly nations around the Gulf. They established the Rapid Deployment Force, the precursor to Central Command. They upgraded the U.S. presence in the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean, and the U.S. ability to project power there. These initiatives provided a foundation and a head start for the much acclaimed Ronald Reagan, Caspar Weinberger Defense Revolution. Although Reagan and his surrogates emphasized the difference between their defense policies and Carter and Brown's, there was much more continuity than contrast. So much, in fact, that I think it's fair to say that the Reagan Defense Revolution began with Carter and Brown. And would you put that slide? Now, this is a picture of if President Reagan and Caspar Weinberger had been in this audience today, this is probably their reaction to my last statement. Now, notwithstanding the Gipper and Cap's skepticism, that's really my case in a nutshell. That's the case of the book in a nutshell. For the remaining time, I'd like to talk about some of the things that people in the Pentagon might be able to learn from Harold Brown's time at DOD. I think a little background is in order before I get into that. In the late 1970s, the Soviet Union tapped huge oil and gas deposits in Siberia. With energy prices high, Moscow came as close as they ever did during the Cold War to overcoming U.S. military superiority. Flush with oil and gas money, the Soviets developed larger and increasingly accurate intercontinental ballistic missiles. To make matters worse, the Soviets were rapidly catching up to U.S. capability to mount multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles, MIRVs, on their ICBMs. Now, in conventional weapons, you can take that slide down. In conventional weapons and troops, the Warsaw Pact always outnumbered NATO forces. NATO had relied on the superiority of its weapons and its personnel. Moscow was fast improving its own tactical conventional technology, especially in armor, mobile artillery, and mobile anti-aircraft weapons. And many people in the Pentagon feared that in a conventional war in Europe, the only thing that would stop the Warsaw Pact was the English Channel. Now, Brown's strategy, or to combat these advantages, was the offset strategy. Create programs of high technology and weapons of high technology and systems that negated the Soviet numerical superiority in troops and weapons systems, and devise systems that turn Soviet advantages into vulnerabilities. For example, having been burned by the Luftwaffe in World War II, the Soviets created the world's most extensive air defense system. It was based on surface-to-air missiles, anti-aircraft guns, interceptor aircraft, and extensive layers of radars. Soviet air defense presented formidable challenges to U.S. penetration bombers. Brown's response was twofold. The first, of course, was stealth aircraft. Invisible to radar, stealth aircraft, when fully developed, would go a long way to negate Soviet air defenses. The second response was nuclear-armed cruise missiles fired from B-52s well beyond Soviet borders. With their contour-hugging technology, cruise missiles required the Soviets to reorient their air defenses from high-flying, radar-visible bombers to numerous low-flying, small, stubby tubes, much more difficult to detect. Cruise missiles were designed with some stealth technology features and were meant to overwhelm Soviet air defenses. The offset strategy also worked for conventional weapons. Brown had encouraged the development of precision-guided munitions using optical and other guidance devices, including lasers and ultimately the global positioning system for honing in on a target. This is a picture of William Perry, Brown's Undersecretary for Research, Defense Research and Engineering, who went on to become Secretary of Defense. And Perry convinced Brown to spend money to launch an additional 20 satellites for a GPS system. There's a story about this. Perry tells it in his book. Perry went to Kirkland Air Force Base in New Mexico at the time of the day when the 4 existing satellites made it possible to use deep GPS navigation. He jumped into a helicopter. The helicopter took off, flew around, and flew back to its precise takeoff point. When Perry learned that the helicopter had been blinded, he immediately realized the potential of GPS, and he sold the system, he sold the idea of completing the system to Brown. You can take that down now. So I think one lesson from the Brown years is play to your strength, in this case, U.S. technology capabilities, to counter your opponent's advantages. Another related lesson from the Brown years is that OSD's support of research and development of technology can result in massive civilian economic payoffs. When someone complains about the defense budget, remind them of Perry's GPS, saving the GPS system, or DoD's long-term financial support of the creation of the internet. Just imagine if smartphones today were only telephones, or printed maps were the only navigational devices. Another series of lessons come from the Iran hostage rescue mission fiasco. Most certainly the low point, I think, for Carter and Brown during their years. The debacle in Desert One, when a Sea Stallion helicopter crashed into a C-130 transport, killing 8 servicemen and wounding 5, and aborting the mission, has been extensively studied. And let's have a photo. This is a photo of the 6 Sea Stallions taking off from for Desert One from the Nimitz. And if there was one thing I think that solidified the public perception of the Carter administration as a military failure, it was the Iran hostage rescue mission. And to me, Iran was really the rock on which the Carter administration floundered. Well, the mistakes that came of the hostage rescue mission were legion. The first mistake was cobbling together a rescue mission from members of different services who had not trained or rehearsed together. I think the second mistake was using the wrong helicopters. These were Marine helicopters, and too few of them. As you remember, or maybe you don't remember, the mission was aborted because they only had 5 helicopters left. By maintaining such tight security on the operation, the rescue mission really was unable to benefit from expert advice that might have improved it. The rescue itself, dubbed Eagle Claw, was just too ad hoc. It suffered from the Entebbe syndrome, the belief that the U.S. could recreate the successful Israeli rescue of its hostages in a Uganda airport. Unfortunately, Tehran was not Entebbe, as Brown initially warned the president. You can take that down now. Brown eventually agreed to the rescue mission, and when it failed, he took full responsibility, although the blame fell equally on Carter and the other few officials who were aware of the operation. Now, the final lesson from Desert One was that if you wanted to have a rescue and anti-terrorism capability, you had to create a permanent force who had trained together. And the one positive emerging from the failed rescue attempt was Carter's approval of a task force to conduct counterterrorism and hostage rescues. The Delta Force, the Navy SEALs, the Air Force rotary and fixed-wing aircraft and their pilots comprised the operational wing of this force, and this organization would be refined and improved by successive administrations. I'd like to talk about one more lesson from Brown's tenure at the Pentagon, and that is that brain power isn't everything. Could you put that slide out? Brown was the most intelligent man, I think, to ever serve as Secretary of Defense. He was a virtual genius with a photographic memory and an unsurpassed mastery of detail. Here he is at 15 years old, graduating from the Bronx School of Science, the premier science school in America at the time. He went on to Columbia, where he won all the awards and earned a PhD from Columbia in physics at the age of 21. He directed the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory before he was 30. So Brown was a formidable intellect. But when the Republican candidate Ronald Reagan and his surrogates in 1980 were bashing Carter's defense policy and the supposed lack of accomplishments, Carter's lack of accomplishments, Brown could not sit idly by. He jumped into the campaign, even though secretaries of defense traditionally do not get involved in presidential campaigns. Now, all his intellect and his rational explanations of Carter's defense achievements in the latter 2 years of the administration failed to convince the voters. The great communicator Ronald Reagan, with his simple but not always accurate message that Carter was weak on defense, resonated with the American voter, and the American voters elected Reagan. I think there is brilliance, which Brown was gifted with, and then there is savvy and the ability to connect with people, which Reagan had in spades. As he was first to admit, Brown was not a people person. He was awkward in social situations and did not always with people he did not always know well. He had no small talk. He seemed often shy, aloof, and even cold. And he fought against this tendency all of his life, but he never really overcame it. Now, despite these drawbacks, Brown's legacy as a Pentagon chief is significant. It provided the foundation for the defense policies of the Reagan administration. Weinberger and Reagan forged a national commitment for defense spending and deployment of new weapons. Their proponents claimed this commitment won the Cold War. In reality, nearly all the Weinberger-Reagan era weapons, with the exception of the Strategic Defense Initiative, which of course never came to pass, were developed or actually deployed during the Brown years. Even the major weapons that Brown and Carter canceled, the B-1 and the Neutron Bomb, remained in research development, allowing them to be easily resuscitated during the 1980s. Reagan and Weinberger are rightly credited with changing the trajectory of U.S. defense, but they could not have succeeded without the work of Brown and his OSD staff. And I will say it again in conclusion, the Weinberger-Reagan revolution in defense began during the last 2 years of the Brown-Carter administration. Thank you. I guess we have time for questions, so. Oh, yes, there's a question.
I'm interested in the decision not to deploy the neutron bomb and the fact that the ability obviously was there, and that I think Alexander Haig was the NATO commander during that time period. And I know from personal experience that General Haig wanted not so much to deploy it, but at least get the Soviets to take something back in response to us not deploying it. Could you comment on that?
Sure, I'd love to. The neutron bomb is one of those weapons that is the most misunderstood bomb in American history. It was actually less destructive than a regular nuclear weapon. Its big problem was, of course, that it killed people and left not the blast area, but the more immediate area infrastructure untouched, and it was perfect for anti-tank warfare. It would take out the tank crews and the tanks as well, but also take out the tank crews, and not that when you didn't hit the tanks because of the radiation killed people. Well, Carter struggled morally with this issue, and finally came to the conclusion that even though he knew the details about the neutron bomb, he couldn't agree to deploy it. But what he did do was he made it possible that if in the next administration, which he assumed he was going to be president, would be able to actually create a neutron bomb. And that's what, in fact, Reagan did, although Reagan never deployed it except in the United States stockpiles. Any other questions? Yeah.
Sir, to what extent did Brown take into account the timing of when he revealed these technological advances to the Soviet Union? That is to say, did he try and do it at the time when it would be most advantageous for the United States and most disadvantageous for the Soviets because of the sunk costs of investments that they've already made which would then leave even less resources for them to change the direction,
Yep.
invest in new things.
That's a good question. I'll use as an example the stealth bomber, the Nighthawk bomber. They didn't want the Soviets to know about this, but as you probably know, it's hard to keep that kind of a secret, even though it was developed with great secrecy. But then during the campaign, Brown actually admitted that we did have stealth technology, and I think this was a mistake. It wasn't a mistake that the Soviets would figure this out, because I think they already knew. But he was accused by the Reagan administration, and virtually everybody, every Republican national security advisor, accused him of releasing classified information and giving the Soviets a heads up that we did have a stealth technology. So I think we would not have wanted them to know that ahead of time, but circumstances of that election really forced him to make that decision. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, sir. Thank you very much. Steve Wills, Center for Naval Analysis. Secretary Brown, from many sources, did not have a good relationship with the United States Navy. It was very professional, but not as good as with the other services. And when you mention Bob Comer to naval leaders of the period, there are obvious groans and moans and did Comer's presence as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy perhaps affect or cause a more bad relationship with the Navy than would have otherwise been possible?
Well, I think I would argue that the relationship with the Navy, Brown's relationship with the Navy, derived from two things. The first thing was he thought the Navy was building too many expensive ships, putting too much stuff on those ships, and was unable to do its job. And particularly, he was opposed to more aircraft carriers. In fact, he went so far as to even say he thought the age of the aircraft carrier was over, and that cruise missiles really made aircraft carriers obsolete. And the other factor, I think, was Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter, served in the Navy and was an Annapolis graduate. But my impression was that Carter really had it in for the Navy, and I think he agreed with almost wholeheartedly with Brown that we were spending way too much money on expensive ships and not enough on smaller, more flexible and adaptable vessels. And of course, Comer would agree 100%. Yeah.
Can you talk to us a little bit about Harold Brown's sort of place in the interagency, how he got along with other cabinet members who were his allies, who were his adversaries?
Okay, let me do that. When the Carter administration began, Brzezinski thought, oh great, Brown will be really for strong defense and for military action. Vance will be for Secretary of State Vance will be for diplomacy, and I'll be the decider. I'll be the guy that makes the decisions in these NSC meetings. Well, it turned out that Brown initially was the decider. He tended to sometimes side with Vance and sometimes side with Brzezinski. As the administration went on, Brown became much closer to Brzezinski's point of view, and actually Brzezinski even claims that Brown became more hardline than he was. But Brown at meetings with, particularly NSC meetings, would be initially would only talk about defense. I mean, he would let the other people have their say, and if it was a defense issue, he would take the lead, which is the way it was supposed to be under the Carter national security system. But as the administration went on, I think he became more and more relied upon by the president, more and more an expert on the SALT negotiations, and his influence grew during the Carter administration. Yep.
You note that Brown, in the last 2 years, became this big proponent of this defense revolution. Do you see any singular event, a geopolitical event, or is it a combination of Soviet improvements and geopolitical events, 79, 80, that make him?
Well, I mean, it wasn't just Brown. It was, of course, the Soviets got far more aggressive in the last 2 years of the Carter administration, and even Carter realized that maybe his idealism about the ability to coexist with the Soviet Union wasn't going to work. But he still was very much opposed to spending for defense. I mean, even though, I mean, Carter was a reluctant conversion to the idea of defense spending, and he was not so much for the weapons, but for the big money items. He wasn't very keen on that. And yeah, way in the back.
Could you discuss Brown's role in Carter's plan to pull troops out of South Korea?
A fiasco, yeah. Carter wanted to take troops out of South Korea, combat troops out of South Korea. He said we can defend South Korea from outside, from the air and with ships. We don't need to have 42,000 troops in South Korea. None of the military advisors, including Brown, said this was a good idea. But Carter insisted, and what eventually happened was that the military, and to a lesser extent Brown, really wore down Carter. But the final blow was that Congress refused to appropriate the money that would have allowed the combat division, I think the 2nd Division in Korea, to leave Korea and go back to Europe. That, of course, cost a lot of money, and they weren't going to pay for that. So Carter gave up finally, and the troops stayed. But everybody agreed, from think tanks to people in strategic thinkers. Oh, it was a bad idea because it sent a bad message. It sent a bad message about our support for East Asia and for Korea itself. Yeah.
So you pointed out a few areas where Brown disagreed with Carter, with the president. Are there any lessons there for Secretary of Defense, later Secretaries of Defense, who may be in the same situation where?
You're not trying to draw me into the current affairs, are you?
I'm not at all. But just,
No.
Are there lessons for how
Well,
the president dealt with Carter?
Brown always said, and I believed him when he told he actually physically, he told this to me when I was interviewing. He said, if I disagree with the president, I would argue within, the internal discussions with him. And Brown was very much of a consistent about that. He would continue to argue and argue and argue, but he wouldn't go public unless he felt it was an issue that was so important that he had to. And then he said he would have resigned. So I think it's a fine line that the Secretary of Defense has to walk, because you can encourage, you can argue, you can rationalize, but eventually, you signed on the job to be the President's Secretary of Defense, not your own Secretary of Defense. And that was Brown's thinking. I think in Korea, I think he probably came as close as ever to really, that might have been the one that he might have resigned on. But he convinced himself that the South Koreans could, in fact, defend themselves. They had a vibrant economy, and the North Koreans at that time were fairly, they had lots of military armor, but they weren't that strong. He felt that South Koreans could probably defend, and then we would come in, the United States would come in under its treaty obligations. Yeah, in the back there.
Second question. How do
Yeah.
you think Brown would cope with today's great power competition with China and Russia?
I wonder. He certainly saw the potential of China. He was the first Secretary of Defense to go to China, and he was very keen to establish a military relationship with China. We gave them some dual-use technology. We intelligence shared, and we certainly cooperated in Afghanistan with the Chinese. So I think he saw the potential of China. I believe he would be a little disappointed now that China has not become so much an ally of the United States as a potential player in a sort of almost like a triangular world. So he's still alive, and he has written books. The most recent one is he does talk about China in that book. Yeah, it's called Star Spangled Security, a kind of curious name, but it's quite a sensible book, and he has quite a lot to say about China. I think he has got some good ideas on that. Any more questions? Yeah.
was Brown's evaluation of the Defense Department that he took over in 77?
Well, remember, Brown had been in the Defense Department 8 years under Kennedy and under Johnson. And in fact, I didn't realize this till I sort of talked to him. He had been one of Kennedy's sort of whiz-kid advisors, not just McNamara's whiz-kid advisors, but Kennedy's, and had gone up to Hyannisport to brief Kennedy on Soviet missile developments, and then I think had also been at the Bermuda Conference. So he had had a high-profile job. Then he became in charge of research and engineering, and then Secretary of the Air Force under Johnson. So he had, of all secretaries of defense, I would argue he was the one that knew how the Defense Department worked the best. He had been there, he knew people, he knew how it worked, and I think he brought into his group of his immediate advisors a very strong group of people. One of which at least went on to be Secretary of Defense, but one went Secretary of Treasury, Transportation. So he was. I think he was one of the most knowledgeable of the Secretaries of Defense about the building itself. You know, most Secretaries of Defense, I would come here, and first day they get lost. Brown knew where he was going. Yeah.
Jump back to 1976. Why and how did Carter come to select him?
He wanted someone he thought that understood weapons, and Brown, before he came to the Defense Department, he designed nuclear weapons, miniaturized them to put them on Poseidon submarines. So he knew weaponry inside out. And then Carter also wanted someone from the business world to run so that's why he chose Charles Duncan, as his deputy secretary. And Carter never met Duncan before, but Carter said to him, if you can work with this guy, you can be Secretary of Defense. If you can't work with this guy, he can be Secretary of Defense. So Carter went over and met with Duncan, and they agreed they could work together, and he took the job. Okay, hope you've learned something about Harold Brown and Jimmy Carter. Thank you very much.
One very important item I forgot to mention, and I shouldn't since I am Ted's boss, is that he's writing the volume covering the first Weinberger period. So he does know of what he talks about in terms of the origins of the Reagan Revolution. He is culling those documents, and that book, I never like to put a publication date, but it will be out in a few years. Security review pending, of course. And there's also going to be another book event for this Brown volume at the National Archives downtown on December 5th, am I correct?
Yes.
Yeah, December 5th, midday, and it will feature not only Dr. Keefer, but also Harold Brown himself, William Perry, and someone you've heard speak here, Elliot Cohen. So if you can leave the building and attend that event, it's an hour. Otherwise, it'll be televised and aired on C-SPAN. So again, Ted, thank you so much. Thank you for coming.